Welcome to today's Explainer. We're jumping right back to the 1930s, a decade literally defined by breadlines, boarded-up banks, and an incredibly gritty global struggle for survival. We're going to unpack exactly what happened during the Great Depression of 1929, and specifically how the world economy collapsed. We'll look directly at the sources to uncover the precise domino effect that brought the Roaring Twenties to a screeching halt and crashed the entire global financial system.
Okay, let's dive into this. Because, to truly understand the Great Depression, you have to grasp the sheer scale of the financial wipeout. Just wrap your head around this number, 85%. Between September of 1929 and July of 1932, the United States stock market lost 85% of its total value. Imagine the absolute shock of waking up and realizing almost the entirety of the market's wealth had just vanished into thin air. It wasn't just a bad month. It was an unprecedented financial disaster.
So to make sense of this catastrophe, we're going to map out the anatomy of the collapse in 5 clear stages. First, the 1929 market crash. Second, bank runs and deflation. Third, trapped by gold. Fourth, the global trade war. And finally, competing economic theories.
All right, let's start with part 1, the 1929 market crash, the spark that ignited the fire. So, leading up to 1929, the US was living through the Roaring Twenties. It was a time of rampant speculation and really loose lending. And that highly flammable environment? Well, it ignited in late October 1929. The panic escalated in a terrifying rapid-fire succession. On Black Thursday, October 24th, the market dropped 11% right at the opening bell. Despite desperate attempts to stabilize things, the bleeding just continued. Just days later on Black Monday, it crashed another 12%. And the very next day, Black Tuesday, saw another 11% plunge. In a single week, billions of dollars were lost and thousands of investors were entirely ruined as this massive sell-off of assets took hold.
Now you might be wondering, how did the market fall so far, so fast? So the crucial point here is debt. During the 1920s, margin requirements were sitting at an incredibly dangerous 10%. That basically meant brokerage firms would lend you $90 for every $10 you actually deposited. It was easy money, and it fueled massive speculation. But when the market started dropping, brokers immediately issued margin calls. They demanded their loans back immediately. Borrowers couldn't pay, leading to mass defaults that dragged down everyone involved.
Moving on to part 2, bank runs and deflation, the domestic fuel.
Let's move to and see how this builds. Wall Street's crash was severe, for sure, but it infected the broader everyday economy through the banking system. We can really see this downward spiral through economist Irving Fisher's famous theory of debt deflation. It's essentially a vicious cycle. As people desperately liquidate their assets to pay off debts, they have to sell at distressed prices. Because bank loans are being paid off or defaulted on, the overall money supply literally shrinks. This makes asset prices fall even further, crushing the net worth of businesses. Bankruptcies soar, factories reduce output, and people panic. The final result? Absolute pessimism and the hoarding of money, which just starves the economy even more.
The human impact of this deflationary spiral was absolutely devastating. Because of this panic, everyday people rushed to their local banks to withdraw their savings in mass, triggering massive bank runs. The system simply could not handle it. During the 1930s, an astounding 9,000 US banks failed. Billions of dollars in deposits were entirely frozen or completely lost. Just imagine your life savings disappearing overnight, simply because your local bank stores were suddenly lacked for good.
Now, what's really interesting about this data is how vividly it captures a global catastrophe. Between 1929 and 1932, industrial production in the US fell by 46%, and in Germany it fell 41%. Wholesale prices plummeted across the board. But really pay attention to the unemployment numbers. In the UK, it jumped 129%, in France, 214%, in Germany, 232%, and in the United States, it skyrocketed an unimaginable 607%. The domestic economic engines of the world's major powers were completely shutting down.
Which brings us to part 3, trapped by gold, the structural trap. With unemployment skyrocketing like that, why didn't governments just rescue their dying economies? Well, their hands were tied by the gold standard. After World War I, most Western nations returned to linking their currency to a fixed amount of gold. This effectively acted as a set of golden fetters, or, a financial straitjacket. To maintain this peg, central banks were forced to keep interest rates high to attract international investors and prevent gold from flowing out of their countries. So at the exact moment the economy desperately needed loose money and low interest rates to survive, the gold standard literally forced governments to tighten the money supply instead.
The consensus among economic historians today is actually quite striking on this issue. As the academic literature directly points out, it was the gold standard that acted as the mechanism turning an ordinary business downturn into the Great Depression. It was essentially a rigid policy of inaction and deflation at exactly the worst possible time in history.
And this brilliantly illustrates the point. The nations that abandoned the gold standard early and devalued their currencies, like Sweden and the UK, escaped the deflationary trap and saw their industrial production recover much faster. Meanwhile, countries that stubbornly clung to gold, like France and Belgium, suffered far longer and experienced much deeper economic stagnation.
Next up is Part 4, the Global Trade War, the global win.
So what spread this domestic economic fire across international borders? The answer is protectionism. In June 1930, the US Congress passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. In a completely misguided, politically driven attempt to protect domestic farmers and American industries from the economic downturn, the US imposed incredibly high tariffs on thousands of foreign imports. The goal was to force Americans to buy American goods, but as economists across all schools of thought agree today, it had the exact opposite effect.
It triggered an immediate avalanche of beggar-thy-neighbor retaliations. Canada slammed duties on American agriculture. France preemptively raised its agricultural tariffs. Italy imposed duties on US autos. Even the UK, the world's historic cheerleader for free trade, abandoned its heritage in 1931 and imposed its own tariffs. Instead of saving domestic jobs, these nations were just smashing the fragile international trading mechanism to pieces.
A quote from the League of Nations beautifully yet tragically sums it up, noting that by mid-1932, the international trading mechanism was in real danger of being completely smashed. Because of these retaliatory tariffs, global trades shockingly plunged to just 1/3 of what it had been only 4 years prior. Everyone tried to insulate themselves, and instead they trapped the entire globe in mutual impoverishment.
Finally, let's look at Part 5, Competing Economic Theories, Analyzing the Autopsy. Decades later, experts still debate the exact weight of these dominoes. There are really two dominant mainstream views here, the Keynesian and the monetarist approaches. The Keynesian view is demand-driven. It argues that a massive loss of confidence led to persistent underconsumption. People just stopped buying things, so the government needed to step in, run deficits, and boost spending to replace that lost demand. The monetarist view, on the other hand, is supply-driven. It argues that the real failure was by the Federal Reserve and central banks, who failed to inject liquidity into the system, allowing the money supply to shrink and ordinary panics to wipe out thousands of banks. Regardless of whether you apply a Keynesian or a monetarist lens, in hindsight, we have to recognize the reality of the people actually living through it. The economic collapse was totally unforeseen and unprecedented. The decision makers of the 1930s were basically flying blind. They lacked modern economic metrics, they were chained to the philosophy of the gold standard, and they had absolutely no historical playbook for a global catastrophe of this magnitude.
Which leaves us with this final thought. We've mapped out the anatomy of the collapse: the speculative spark, the deflationary fuel, the gold trap, and the winds of a global trade war. Now, today, we have central banks that print money, deposit insurance to stop bank runs, and global trade organizations. But as our modern, deeply interconnected global economy continues to evolve with new complexities, it forces us to ask, are we truly better equipped today to stop the dominoes of debt, tariffs, and panic, or are we just building different ones? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.